The morning Clara Ashford turned 23, her father sold her. Not in those words, of course. Thomas Ashford called it an arrangement, a practical solution. He stood in the front room of their weathered farmhouse with his hat in his hands and told her that Silas Boone had offered a fair price for the eastern pasture in exchange for her hand, and that she should start packing because the wedding was set for the end of the month. Clara didn't scream, she didn't cry. She looked at her father, the man who had called her his treasure her entire life, and watched him look at the floorboards instead of her face. "You're not asking me," she said. "There's nothing to ask," he said, and he walked out. If you've ever felt like someone treated you as less than you were worth, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. The valley of Cutter's Creek sat at the feet of the Absaroka Range, and in late October the mountains had already begun pulling their white curtain down toward the tree line. The air smelled like pine resin and cold, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge each morning, most of the settlement's men had been working for 2 hours already. It was that kind of place. A place where people didn't have time to be delicate about things. Clara had grown up knowing she was beautiful. Not in the vain way. She hadn't chosen it, had never asked for it, and had learned early on that it created as many problems as it solved. Men stared at her in town. Women watched their husbands stare. Mothers steered their sons away from her at socials, as if her face were a kind of dangerous weather. By the time she was 17, she had learned to move through public spaces with her eyes down and her shoulders slightly curved inward, trying to take up less space than she actually did. Her mother had died when Clara was 12, and after that it was just her and Thomas in that farmhouse, and Thomas had never quite known what to do with a daughter who looked the way Clara looked. He was a practical man who dealt in livestock and grain, and Clara suspected that somewhere in the back of his mind, even when she was small, he had filed her under the category of things that would eventually need to be placed somewhere sensible. She had hoped for something different. She had spent years quietly hoping for it. Not a fairy story, not some prince from back east, just someone who might look at her and think about something other than the color of her eyes. What she got was her father's hat in his hands, and his gaze fixed on the floor. The morning after Thomas told her, Clara rose before light and walked the perimeter of the farm the way she always did when something was eating at her. The frozen grass crunched under her boots. The sky in the east was going gray and cold. She stopped at the fence line and looked out at the eastern pasture her father had apparently traded away along with her entire future, and she tried to feel something clean, anger, maybe, or grief. But what she felt was mostly a kind of hollow tiredness, like she'd been running a long race and someone had just told her the finish line had moved. She knew who Silas Boone was the way everyone in the valley knew him, from a distance, and mostly by rumor. He was 8 years older than her, quiet in the way that made some people nervous. And he lived alone in a cabin so far up the North Ridge that his nearest neighbor was a 40-minute ride. He came into town every 2 weeks or so for supplies, traded furs and venison with a few of the merchants, spoke when spoken to, and left. Nobody had a bad word to say about him, which in Clara's experience either meant a man was genuinely decent or so private that his faults hadn't surfaced yet. She walked back to the house when the sky started to lighten and found her father at the table with his coffee. "Tell me why," she said. She didn't sit down. Thomas wrapped his hands around the mug and stared into it. "Ranch is struggling. You know that. I know the East Pasture's been dry 3 years running. That doesn't explain why you're trading me with it." "I'm not trading you, Clara. Boone wanted the land and What did he give you?" A pause. "Water rights to the creek bend." She stood there and let that land. Water rights to the creek bend. Her father had been after those water rights for 15 years, ever since the Harmon family had diverted the stream and left his south fields half dead every other summer. She understood the logic of it. She almost wished she didn't, because understanding it made it harder to be purely furious, and she needed to be furious. "And what does Silas Boone get?" she asked. Thomas finally looked up. "A wife? He could find a wife. He doesn't go looking. So he bought one instead." "Clara, I'm packing," she said. "Don't talk to me right now." She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before she moved toward the trunk. The room had been hers her whole life, the quilt her mother had made, The small oval mirror with the crack across one corner, the dried flowers she'd hung from the curtain rod years ago and forgotten to take down. She looked at all of it and thought about what it meant to leave, not because you wanted to, but because the decision had already been made for you by someone who was supposed to love you. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere as a man's purchased arrangement. She started folding. Word had gotten around the settlement faster than Clara would have liked. It always did. By the time she came into town 2 days before the wedding to pick up thread and a few yards of fabric, the whispers were already moving ahead of her like water finding its level. She heard it from Martha Gaines first, the blacksmith's wife, who had the peculiar ability to say unkind things in a perfectly pleasant tone. "Well," Martha said, appearing at the dry goods counter as if she'd been waiting, "I suppose even Silas Boone couldn't stay alone forever. Though I do wonder what a man like that wants with a girl like you." Clara looked at her steadily. "Thread, and 2 yards of brown wool. I only mean," Martha continued, undeterred, "that he's not exactly the sort of man you'd picture for someone so, well, you know what I mean." "I don't," Clara said, "but I don't need to." She paid for her things and left before Martha could find another angle. Outside, she nearly walked directly into James Whitmore, who ran the feed store and who had, 3 years ago, asked her father if he might court her. Thomas had said it was Clara's decision. Clara had said no, politely, twice, and James had never quite forgiven her for it. He looked at her now with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Heard about the arrangement," he said. "Boone's a lucky man." "Good afternoon, James." "Must be strange, knowing your father." "Goodbye, James." She walked to where she'd tied her horse and stood there for a moment with her hand on the saddle, the cold air moving through her hair, and she thought, this is what it's going to be. People looking at her face and making calculations about what it must mean to have that face and be in this situation. Nobody asking what she thought. Nobody considering that she might have an interior life worth consulting. She mounted up and rode home without speaking to anyone else. Chawton. The wedding was brief and practical, which suited no one except possibly Silas Boone, who seemed entirely unbothered by the lack of ceremony. The minister from the settlement came out on a Saturday morning, said the required words in the front room of the Ashford farmhouse, and within 20 minutes Clara was a married woman holding a small bunch of dried sage that Thomas had apparently grabbed from the kitchen because he'd forgotten about flowers. Silas stood beside her through the whole thing with his hands at his sides and his expression attentive, like a man listening to instructions he intended to follow carefully. He was taller than she'd registered from a distance, broad through the shoulders, with weathered hands, and a jaw that looked like it had been arranged by someone who valued function over elegance. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His boots were clean, which she noticed because it was the kind of thing that told you something. He didn't try to hold her hand during the ceremony. He didn't look at her the way men usually looked at her, that assessing, possessive look she'd grown so tired of. He watched the minister, and he answered his lines clearly, and when it was over he picked up her trunk before anyone asked him to and carried it out to the wagon. Thomas tried to catch Clara's eye as she was leaving. She didn't let him. The ride up to the North Ridge took 2 hours. Most of it they spent in silence, and it was not, Clara was surprised to discover, an entirely uncomfortable silence. She had expected something to fill it. Boasting, maybe. Proprietorial questions. The slow beginning of a negotiation about what her life was going to look like now. Instead, Silas sat beside her on the wagon bench and occasionally pointed out a landmark on the ridge or told her something practical. That the road got steep about a mile ahead, that the crossing at Miller's Creek ran high in spring, that there was a shortcut she'd need to know for the winter months. He didn't tell her she was beautiful. He didn't tell her much of anything, actually, except things she might need. She found this profoundly disorienting. The cabin, when they reached it, was small and solid and had been built with more care than she'd expected. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace that dominated the main room, a sleeping loft above, and a separate bedroom off to the side that looked like it had been recently cleaned. The floor swept, a quilt folded on the bed, a small lamp on the stand beside it. Silas set her trunk down inside the bedroom door. "This is your room," he said. Clara looked at him. "Where do you sleep?" He nodded toward the main room. "Bedroll near the fire. I'm up early. The cold comes through the walls before dawn." She watched him for a moment, waiting for the shape of this to become clear to her. The the terms underneath the arrangement, the thing he was working toward. "Is this a negotiation?" she asked. "Am I supposed to be grateful?" He considered that without any apparent offense. "No," he said. "You're supposed to be as comfortable as I can make you. The rest is up to you." "Up to me how?" He looked at her then, not the way men usually did, not like he was cataloging something, more like he was trying to figure out how to say something he'd already thought through carefully. "This wasn't your choice," he said. "I know that. I told your father before we settled on anything that I wouldn't expect from you what I hadn't earned." That still stands. The cabin was quiet around them. Outside, a wind had come up off the ridge and was pressing against the boards. "You talked to my father before the arrangement?" she said. "Yes." "And he told you I would agree?" "He told me you would do what he asked." Something cold moved through her chest. Not surprise exactly, just the shape of the thing becoming clearer than she'd hoped. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," Silas said. "It isn't." He moved toward the main room. "There's stew on. Eat when you're ready." The next 2 weeks were unlike anything Clara had experienced. She had grown up with men who, once they had obtained or wanted something, could not help announcing it. Her father, for all his affections, had held her beauty up to visitors like a lantern. "My daughter, can you believe it?" James Whitmore had spent his entire courtship attempt describing her to other people as though she wasn't in the room. The men who stared in town didn't bother hiding it. Silas didn't stare. He wasn't performing consideration. He simply went about his work as though Clara were a person in his house who had needs and preferences that deserved to be accommodated. He asked her once, early on, whether she preferred coffee or tea in the mornings. She said coffee. After that, there was always coffee made before she woke. He was gone most of the day, trapping the upper line, cutting wood, doing whatever it was he did on that ridge that kept them in meat and fuel, and the small amounts of trade income that kept the cabin running. He came back in the late afternoon, sometimes tracking mud, sometimes with blood from cleaning a deer, always bringing something, wood or meat, or once a cluster of late-season berries he'd found on the south face and set on the table without comment. Clara didn't know what to do with him. She had prepared herself for a hard husband. She had prepared herself for demands, for a man who felt that the transaction had entitled him to whatever he wanted. She had prepared herself to endure. None of that preparation was useful here. What she hadn't prepared herself for was boredom, and so to fight it, she started doing things. She reorganized the main room because it made no practical sense. She repaired a gap in the window framing that had been letting in cold. She found his stores and inventoried them because the winter was coming and she needed to know what they had, and she wrote it all down in the small notebook she kept in her trunk and started calculating what they'd need. Silas came home one afternoon and found her elbow deep in a reconfigured pantry. He stopped in the doorway and looked at it. "The dried meat was next to the flour," she said, without turning around. "Moisture goes wrong, you lose both." A pause. "I've done it that way for years." "Then you've been lucky." She moved a tin to the upper shelf. "The flour goes up here, stays drier. Dried meat stays near the cold wall." She heard him come in and set something down. "That makes sense," he said. It was such a mild response that she almost looked over her shoulder to see if he was being sarcastic. He wasn't. He was hanging his coat up and looking at the pantry with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "I also found a crack in the northeast wall behind the big chest," she said. "Wind's been coming through. You'll need to pack it before the hard freeze. I'll do it tomorrow. I started a list of what we're short on for winter." A longer pause this time. "How short?" She handed him the notebook. He read it standing there, still in his work clothes, turning through the pages she'd filled with her small, precise handwriting. His face as he read it was serious and attentive, and something about that, about being taken seriously, about having her work looked at carefully instead of dismissed, made Clara's chest do something unexpected. "This is thorough," he said. "I grew up on a farm." "I know that." He handed the notebook back. "I'll go into town next week and get what we need." He paused. "If you want to add anything before then." She took the notebook and didn't say anything. Later, when she was lying in the bedroom listening to the wind pick up outside, she thought about that exchange and couldn't quite account for why it had mattered as much as it did. The first thing that cracked her open was the Henderson boy. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, and Silas had come home earlier than usual. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it, and when she went to the window, she could see there was someone else in it. A boy of about 10, wrapped in Silas's coat, his face pale and pinched with cold. Silas brought him inside without ceremony. "Foot's bad," he said. "Found him on the East Trail. His family's the Henderson claim, about 4 miles out." The boy, his name was Owen, he managed through chattering teeth, had gotten his boot soaked crossing a stream and then spent 3 hours on the trail before Silas had come across him. The foot wasn't frostbitten, but it was cold and swollen, and he couldn't put weight on it. Clara moved to heat water without being asked. She unwrapped the boot carefully, watching Owen's face to gauge his pain, and she probed the swelling the way her mother had taught her. Not frostbite, just badly chilled and probably a light sprain from how he'd been walking to compensate for it. "How long were you out there?" she asked him. "Since morning," he said. "I was trying to get to the Darnell place. My sister's there and Mama sent me." He looked at her with eyes that were large and brown and frightened underneath the attempt to look stoic. "She's going to think something happened to me." "We'll get word to your family," Clara said. She looked up at Silas. He was already moving toward the door. "I'll ride to the Henderson place," he said. "Tell them where he is. Bring someone back for him. 2 hours." "I'll keep him warm." Silas left. Clara sat with Owen while the water heated, and she wrapped his foot and gave him broth and listened to him talk about his family, the way children talked when they were scared and needed to fill the silence. 4 brothers, a baby sister, their father building a new room onto the cabin before winter hit. "His mother made the best biscuits in the valley," he said earnestly. "I believe it," Clara said. "Do you make biscuits?" "I do." "Silas is lucky then," Owen said, with the absolute unguarded certainty of a 10-year-old stating an obvious fact. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Eat your broth," she said. Silas came back 2 hours and 15 minutes later with Owen's older brother behind him on a second horse, while the brother was gathering Owen up and managing the gratitude that Silas tried to wave away. Genuinely tried to wave away. Without the performance of false modesty, just a quiet, "He would have been all right. It wasn't far." Clara watched from the doorway. She had seen men perform generosity before. She knew what that looked like, how the eyes tracked to see if you were watching, how the voice shifted when an audience was present. This was not that. Silas was actually trying to end the conversation, moving away from the brother's thanks with a kind of mild discomfort, like the attention was something he'd rather not hold. That night, after the Henderson boy was gone and dinner was done and the fire had burned down to coals, Clara said, "You didn't have to ride all the way out there." Silas was sharpening a knife at the table. He didn't look up. He needed to get home. "You'd already done your part. You brought him in from the cold." His mother didn't know where he was. Clara was quiet for a moment. Most men would have sent a message with one of the merchants when they went to town. "That would have taken 3 days." "I know." He looked up at that. His expression was simply direct. No performance in it, no fishing. "It was 2 hours of riding," he said. "It wasn't much." She thought about what she wanted to say to that. She thought about it for longer than was probably warranted, and decided eventually to say nothing, which was a decision she almost immediately felt had been wrong. The second crack was a smaller and took her more by surprise. She had gone out to the woodpile early one morning because the main room was cold and Silas hadn't yet come in from wherever he'd been at first light. She was perfectly capable of stacking wood. She had done it her whole childhood. But when she reached the pile, she found it already split and stacked and covered with an oilcloth against the weather. It had been there the day before, she realized, and the day before that. She stood there looking at it in the thin morning light and ran backward through the previous 3 weeks and realized that the wood had never, not once, been low by the time she went to get it. She had assumed Silas built up the fire before bed, and that was that. But the pile had been replenished every day, and when she thought about his schedule, she understood that he must be doing it before she rose. In the dark, before the cold broke, while she was still asleep. There was no one to see this. There was no audience. He didn't mention it at dinner. He didn't ever reference it. She went back inside and stood at the window with her coffee and thought about what it meant to do a thing consistently, privately, without acknowledgement, simply because it needed doing. She had never had someone do that for her before. The morning the Darnell brothers came was the moment everything that had been building under the surface finally broke through. She heard the horses first, and then the voices, and by the time she opened the door, they were already in the yard. 4 of them, the Darnell men, who ran the big cattle operation 12 miles down the valley. They had the look of men who had ridden a long way and were not happy about it, though Clara suspected they hadn't ridden anywhere at all and were merely performing the energy of men who had been inconvenienced. The eldest, Frank Darnell, was addressing Silas in the yard with a volume she could hear clearly from the doorway. "Those fence lines on the north quarter don't follow the original survey," Frank was saying. "You've got posts on Darnell land, Boone." Silas's voice was level. "The survey was done in '79. Those posts are on my property." "The '79 survey's disputed. You know that." "What I know is that I can show you the markers, Frank." "Markers move." Silas looked at him. "Not unless someone moves them." The implication sat in the cold air between them. Clara watched Frank's jaw tighten. The 3 brothers behind him shifted their weight, and she recognized the choreography of men building toward something. Not necessarily violence, but the threat of it, the suggestion that it could arrive. "I want those posts moved by the end of the month," Frank said, "or we'll have a problem." "You already have a problem," Silas said. "You're on my land right now." Frank's gaze moved past Silas to the doorway where Clara was standing. It stopped there the way men's gazes always stopped when they found her, and she watched the calculation move across his face. "Heard you got married," Frank said, his voice shifting into something that wanted to be smooth. "That your wife?" "Yes," Silas said. His voice had not changed. Frank looked at her for another moment with that particular kind of attention she'd spent her life learning to recognize and hate. "Pretty thing," he said, like she was livestock he was appraising. "Didn't think you had that in you, Boone." "Are we done here?" Silas said. Frank looked back at him. Something in Silas's face apparently settled the question of whether they were done, because Frank pulled his horse around and nodded to his brothers. "End of the month," he said again. "My survey marks don't move," Silas said. They rode out. Clara stayed in the doorway while the sound of the horses faded down the trail. Silas stood in the yard for a moment without moving, and she watched the set of his shoulders, the carefully held stillness of a man who was angry and not letting it into his body. He turned and came toward the cabin and stopped when he saw her face. "The fence line is yours," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "He knows that." "Yes." She stepped back to let him inside. "Then why come?" Silas came in and hung his coat. "Because he thinks I'll back down." He went to the table and stood there a moment, running one hand across the back of the chair. "He's been watching this property for 3 years. His father tried the same thing with the man who owned it before me. Did it work?" That man moved. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching him. "Are you going to move?" He looked at her with a steadiness that she had come to understand was simply him, not stubbornness, not performance, just the natural set of a man who had decided what he was and what he wasn't. "No," he said. "Then you'll need documentation," she said. "The original survey, whatever correspondence there is." "Who was the surveyor?" He blinked slightly. "A man named Aldous Kraft. He's in Harborton." "Can you write to him?" "I can ride to him." "Better," she said. "Write first. Get him to send a copy of the original survey by post so you have it. Then ride if you need to. You want a paper trail before this becomes a legal matter." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know about that kind of thing?" "My father spent 8 years in a boundary dispute with the Harmon family," she said. "I sat in on every conversation he had with his lawyer." She paused. "He didn't win, but I know what he did wrong." There was something in Silas's expression that Clara couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, and not the particular kind of delighted condescension that some men showed when a woman said something they found unexpectedly sensible. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, in the low light of the cabin's main room, very much like plain respect. "I'll write to Kraft today," he said. "Good." She moved to put the kettle on. "Write to the county recorder's office, too. They keep copies of surveys older than the landowners. If Darnell disputes your copy, you want an independent source. Silas sat down at the table. He pulled paper from the drawer without fanfare and uncapped the inkwell, and he started writing. He was at it for 20 minutes, and when he was done, he set the letters aside to dry and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who'd been carrying something that had just gotten slightly lighter. "Clara," he said. She was at the window, looking out at where the Darnell men had ridden off toward the tree line. "Thank you," he said. She didn't answer right away. Outside, the first flakes of what would become the season's first real snow were beginning to fall. "We should talk about what we'll need if they try to build on the disputed quarter," she said, "while the ground's still soft enough to check the markers." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right. Tomorrow. While there's light." "Tomorrow," he agreed. She didn't look away from the window. The snow was coming down heavier now, settling into the yard, covering the tracks the Darnell horses had left. By morning, you wouldn't be able to tell they'd been there at all. But she knew. And Silas knew. And the letters were drying on the table, and the record was already started. Some things, she was beginning to understand, you protected not by fighting, but by making yourself impossible to erase. The snow that had started falling the evening of the Darnell visit didn't stop for 3 days. By the second morning, the yard was buried past the bottom of the fence posts, and the trail down to the valley was nothing but a white suggestion between the trees. Silas moved through all of it without apparent complaint, feeding the animals, clearing the path to the woodpile, checking the roof where one section over the lean-to had been sagging since fall. Clara watched him from the window while she made breakfast and thought, not for the first time, that this was a man who had arranged his life around the expectation that nobody was coming to help him. Everything he did had that quality, thorough and quiet and done without waiting to see if it would be acknowledged. She brought coffee out to him while he was working on the lean-to roof, which was probably unnecessary and which she told herself was simply practical. He took the mug without making a thing of it, which she appreciated. "The ridge vent's clear," he said, nodding upward. "Snow's heavy this year." "Is that unusual?" "For October?" "Yes." He drank the coffee and looked at the sky with the particular expression of a man reading something she couldn't see. "Winter's coming early." "I already adjusted the supply list," she said. He glanced at her. "Adjusted how?" "Added 2 weeks of buffer. If the pass closes before December, we'll need it." She paused. "I also think we should put up more dried venison if you can get it. What we have is enough for a normal winter." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the line of trees where the trail disappeared. "There's a herd working the south-facing slope above Miller's Creek. I've been watching them." "How soon?" 3 days if the snow holds off. Tomorrow if it doesn't." "Go tomorrow," she said. He looked at her then with that steady, considering look she'd begun to find she could hold without feeling the need to look away. "You'll be here alone." "I've been alone before," she said. Something moved across his face, not argument, just a kind of careful attention. "The Darnells rode the North Trail 2 days ago." She understood what he wasn't saying. "I can manage the Darnells." "I don't doubt that," he said. "I'm just telling you where they were." She thought about that. "Is there a rifle I can use?" "Above the fireplace, loaded." He handed her back the empty mug. "You know how to shoot?" "My father made sure of it." She turned back toward the cabin door. "Go tomorrow. We need the meat more than we need you standing on a roof." She heard what she thought might have been a short, low sound behind her that could, in the right context, have been a laugh. She didn't look back. He left before light the next morning and was not back by dark, which she had expected. She made herself a simple supper, banked the fire the way she'd learned from watching him, and sat at the table with his copy of the county land records he'd pulled out the night before and began reading through them in the lamplight. She had meant it when she said she knew about land disputes. What she hadn't told Silas was the full extent of it, that she had sat in on not just her father's conversations with his lawyer, but had, in the last years before she left, been the one keeping his files organized, drafting correspondence, tracking dates and responses. Thomas Ashford had known his daughter was managing most of his paperwork by the time she was 18 and had never once mentioned it to anyone, because acknowledging it would have required him to acknowledge what she was capable of, and that was a more complicated thing than he was prepared to do. The Darnell situation had a shape she recognized. The claim about the disputed survey was almost certainly not a legal argument. If Frank Darnell had a genuine legal case, he'd have sent a lawyer, not 4 writers. What he was doing was establishing a pressure, testing whether Silas would move first. If Silas moved the posts, even slightly, even as a gesture of goodwill, he'd have conceded the principle. From there, it was documentation, then filing, then suddenly Darnell's legal argument existed because Silas's own actions had created it. She wrote all of this down in her notebook, clearly and in order, with dates. Then she went back to the land records and started mapping the boundary descriptions against what Silas had told her about where the actual fence post stood. She was still at it when the fire burned low. She rebuilt it, went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to the wind off the ridge and thinking about survey lines. Silas came back the following afternoon with 2 deer across the back of the pack horse, half frozen and satisfied in the wordless way of a man who had done exactly what he set out to do. Clara had the fire high and a pot going, and she came outside when she heard the horses because there was work to do, and standing in the doorway waiting was not how she operated. He looked at her when she appeared, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small rearrangement of the features that she was beginning to learn to read. Relief, she thought, that she was there, and intact. "Darnell's come by?" he asked. "No." "Good." He swung down and started untying the first deer. "How are the stores?" "Fine. I reorganized the cold cellar." She moved to take the other end of the deer's carcass. He didn't protest, which by now she had accepted as his baseline response to her doing things, simply incorporating it, moving to accommodate it. "I also finished going through the land records." He stopped. "And?" "Come inside when this is done. I want to show you something." It took an hour to get the deer hung and covered and the horses settled. By the time they sat down at the table, dark had come fully down and the wind was picking up again. Clara spread her notes out and walked him through it carefully. The boundary descriptions, the discrepancy she'd found in Darnell's implied claim, and the specific date in 1882 when the county had last updated the survey records. Silas followed every word of it. He didn't interrupt, didn't look at her the way men sometimes looked at women who were explaining things, that slightly glazed patience that wasn't actually listening. He leaned over the table and read what she pointed to and asked 2 questions, both of which were specific and useful. "So Darnell's claim would have to rest on the 1879 survey," he said, "which you have a copy of, and which shows the boundary exactly where your posts are." "But he could still dispute the physical markers." "He could, which is why you need Aldiscraft to come out and resurvey it in person." She tapped the notes. "If you have a current professional survey that confirms the original boundary, any legal challenge has to overcome 2 surveys. That's expensive and slow. Darnell knows that. He's betting you won't spend the money." Silas sat back in his chair. He was looking at her notes with a focus that had moved past the content itself into something she couldn't quite read. "Clara," he said. "What? Where did you learn all this?" She looked at him. "I told you, my father's dispute with the Harmons." "You said you sat in on the conversations." "I did. I also organized the files, drafted the letters." She picked up her pen. "And my father lost because he didn't do any of this early enough, and his lawyer was charging him by the hour and ran out the clock." She paused. "I've been thinking about your situation since the night the Darnells came. I had time while you were hunting." He said nothing for a moment, then, "He didn't know you were doing all that?" "He knew, he just didn't say it out loud." "Why not?" She looked at him steadily. "Because saying it out loud would have meant I was something other than a pretty daughter he could place somewhere sensible." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved something loose on the lean-to roof and rattled it briefly before letting go. Silas was quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was actually thinking, rather than just pausing. "I'll write to Kraft this week," he said finally. "Ask him to come out before the ground freezes." "Ask him to come before the end of the month," Clara said. "If Darnell's planning a move, he'll do it while the weather's in his favor." "All right." He looked at her notes again. "Can I keep these?" "I made copies." She pulled a second set of pages from under the first. These are yours. I kept the originals. He took the pages and looked at them for a moment in a way that she found she couldn't interpret, and then he set them carefully on the side of the table away from the lamp. Thank you, he said, for the second time in less than a week. The first time he'd said it, she hadn't known what to do with it. She was beginning to get used to it, which itself was something she was not sure how to think about. No. The letter from her father arrived 10 days later, carried up by the mail rider who made the Ridge circuit once a fortnight. Clara saw the handwriting on the envelope and set it on the table and looked at it for 5 minutes before she opened it. Thomas wrote the way he spoke, practically, without apology, building toward the thing he wanted. He asked whether she was settled. He mentioned the east pasture looked good with the water rights restored. He said her Aunt Vera had been asking after her. He said he hoped Silas was treating her decently. He did not say he was sorry. She read it twice, then folded it back along its creases and put it in her trunk under her mother's quilt. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while after that in the gray afternoon light, feeling the particular weight of a thing that had not quite broken, but had bent so far it would never sit straight again. Silas came in an hour later and found her in the main room at the window, which was where she went when she was working something through. He looked at her face once, didn't comment on it, and went to the fire. "Let her come?" he said. The mail rider's horse tracks would have been in the yard. "From my father." "You don't have to tell me what it said." "He didn't apologize," she said. Not angrily, just the fact of it. Silas didn't say anything for a moment. He set a log on the fire and stayed crouched there, looking at the flames. "Does that surprise you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I've been his daughter for 23 years. He's never apologized for anything. Some men don't know how. Some men don't think they need to." He was quiet. The fire took the new log. "Did he ask how you were?" Silas said. "In a practical way. Whether I was settled." "And are you?" He asked it simply, the way he asked most things. Without agenda, without needing a particular answer. Clara looked out the window at the gray sky above the tree line. The snow had melted off the south-facing slopes, but was still deep in the shadows under the pines. "Better than I expected," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He didn't press it. He stood up from the fire and went to start supper, and the conversation moved on the way their conversations tended to, naturally, without ceremony, turning toward the practical things that needed doing. But later that night, lying in the bedroom listening to the wind, Clara thought about what he'd asked. "Are you settled?" And she realized that the answer she'd given him was more true than she'd meant it to be. The Darnell problem came back before Kraft could make it up the ridge, and it came back in the form of Frank Darnell's youngest brother, Pete, who showed up at the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon while Silas was working the east tree line. Clara answered the door. Pete Darnell was 24 and had the look of a man who had coasted his whole life on the fact that his family had money and would back whatever he did. He was not ugly, and he knew it, and he used it the way some men used height, as a first point of pressure, a way of taking up space before the conversation started. He looked at Clara the way his brother had looked at her in the yard, and he let it go on a beat too long before he spoke. "Mrs. Boone," he said, making her name sound like a mistake. "Is your husband about?" "He's working," she said. She did not open the door further. "That's all right. I can wait." "What's your business?" He smiled. "Family matter. Between the men." "Then you can come back when he's here," she said. "When's he expected?" "I'll just wait," Pete said, and she saw him start to move forward slightly. Not a full step, just a test, the way you'd test ice. "You'll wait in the yard," Clara said. Her voice was even. "Or you'll leave and come back. Those are the choices." Something shifted in his expression. The smile stayed, but went flat at the edges. "No need to be unfriendly." "I'm not being unfriendly. I'm being clear." She looked at him without expression. "Is there a message I can give him?" Pete studied her for a moment with the look of a man recalibrating. She'd seen it before. The moment when a man decided a woman was going to be more complicated than he'd counted on. "Frank wants to meet," he said. "Thursday, at the Ridge Road Junction." "I'll tell him." "You sure you'll remember?" "Goodbye, Mr. Darnell." She closed the door. She stood behind it for a moment, listening to his footsteps in the yard, then the sound of a horse moving away. She let out a slow breath. When Silas came in at dusk, she told him about the visit in detail, not editorializing, just the sequence of it. He listened with his coat still on. "He tried to come in," he said. "He tested it. I didn't let him." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He's younger than Frank, likes to push and see what happens." "I noticed." "Did he—" He paused, the question apparently not coming easily. "He was rude," she said. "Nothing more than that." She looked at him. "You're wondering if you should have been here?" "Yes." "You can't be here every time someone rides up." She moved to take the stew off the hook. "And you wouldn't know what to do with a man like Pete Darnell without making it worse. He wants a confrontation. I gave him nothing." Silas came to the table and sat down heavily. He rubbed one hand across his jaw, and the gesture she'd learned meant he was working through something he didn't like. "Frank won't send Pete again," he said. "If I don't show at the junction Thursday, he'll take that as its own answer." "Are you going?" "I'm thinking on it." "Don't go alone," she said. He looked up at that. "If you go to that meeting and it's just you," she said, "he controls the terms. Take someone. Whoever in this valley you trust." "Roy Calhoun," he said after a moment. "He's got a place 3 miles down. Known him 12 years. Tell Roy before Thursday. Tell him what it's about, and bring the survey copy." "To a meeting at a road junction?" "Bring it. If Frank wants to talk boundary lines, you show him immediately that you have the documentation. It changes what he thinks he's dealing with." She set 2 bowls on the table. "He's testing you. Everything he's done so far is a test. You want to pass the test without swinging at him." Silas looked at the bowl in front of him, and then at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not surprise exactly, just the look of a man who kept finding something where he hadn't expected it. "You've been thinking about this a lot," he said. "I don't have enough to do," she said plainly. "I'm used to running a household, and I'm running this one in 4 hours a day. The rest of the time, I think." He considered that. "What would you do if you had more to do?" She sat down across from him. "I'd want to know this operation, what you trap, what you trade, and to whom. What your margins look like over a year." She picked up her spoon. "You're running this entirely in your head. If something happened to you, there'd be nothing written down." The directness of that, "if something happened to you," landed visibly. He didn't flinch from it, just absorbed it the way he absorbed most things. "You want to see the books," he said. "If there are books?" "There's a ledger." He nodded toward the shelf near the fireplace. "It's not organized." "I know. I looked at it." She met his eyes. "I wasn't snooping. I was bored. And it was there." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. "What did you think?" "I think you've been making better decisions than your records suggest. You've just been doing it all by memory." She set her spoon down. "Let me put it in order." He looked at her for a long moment, then he got up and retrieved the ledger and set it on the table between them. "Go ahead," he said. She spent 3 days on the ledger. She worked at the table in the mornings while Silas was out, and she found exactly what she'd suspected. The income was there, the decisions had been sound, but it was all implicit and untracked, a system that existed only as long as Silas existed to carry it in his head. She organized it by quarter, wrote in what she knew of his current trade relationships, flagged 3 expenses she thought he was overplaying and 2 income streams she thought he was undervaluing. On the 3rd evening, she presented it to him and watched his face as he read through it. "The Kettner trade," he said, stopping at a page. "You've got a note here. You're selling him prime pelts at the same price as seconds. He's been getting the better end of that for at least 2 years." Silas looked at the numbers. "We've had an arrangement since I first came up here." "Arrangements can be renegotiated," she said, "especially when they're this far off market value. I checked the merchant prices in town. Your prime pelts are worth 30% more than what Kettner's paying." He sat back. He had a particular way of sitting back in his chair when he was recalibrating, spine straight but weight settled, arms loose. He was doing it now. "Kettner's not going to like it," he said. "He doesn't have to like it. He has to decide whether the relationship's worth the adjusted price." She paused. "Is it a friendship or a business arrangement that's become comfortable?" A silence. "Somewhere between," he admitted. "Then the friendship will survive a fair price." She looked at him. Or it won't, and you'll know what it was worth. He was quiet for a bit longer this time. You know, he said, most people who come up here and look at this operation assume I'm doing badly because I'm alone and the cabin's small. Are you? No, I'm doing well. I just don't look like it from the outside. You're doing well because you make good decisions, she said. You'd do better if someone was writing them down. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. Will you keep doing this? The question was simple and direct, and somehow it hit her differently than she expected, somewhere behind the sternum where she wasn't quite prepared for it. Yes, she said. If you want me to. I want you to. She nodded and pulled the ledger back toward her to make a final note. Outside, the wind was picking up the way it did before snow. The lamp threw its small circle of light over the table between them, over the organized columns and the careful handwriting and the two people on either side of them, neither of whom had expected to be here, doing this, and both of whom were, she was starting to understand, finding something in it they hadn't known they were looking for. She didn't examine that thought too closely. She just wrote the note and closed the ledger and said she'd have a full summary ready by the end of the week. Silas said good. And then neither of them said anything for a while, and the fire burned, and the wind moved through the pines outside, and it was not an uncomfortable silence at all. The summary she'd promised was ready by Friday, 6 pages of her small, precise handwriting laid out in the order Silas would need them: quarterly income, trade relationships ranked by value and reliability, the 3 expenses she'd flagged, and a separate page on the Kettner situation with comparable market prices she'd pulled from the merchant receipts he'd kept loose in the back of the ledger drawer. She set it on the table before he came in and then deliberately went to work on something else, because she didn't want to be standing over it when he read it, watching his face for a reaction she wasn't sure she was ready to interpret. He came in at his usual time, stopped when he saw the pages, and sat down without taking his coat off. She stayed at the window working on the mending she'd been putting off for a week, and listened to the sound of pages turning behind her. He was quiet for longer than she expected. The Kettner page, he said finally. What about it? You've got the market comparison going back 4 years. I used the receipts in the drawer, the ones from the town merchants. She didn't turn around. The pricing pattern's been consistent. He's not cheating you. The price you agreed to was fair when you agreed to it. The market moved and the arrangement didn't. That's a gentler way of putting it than I expected. She did turn around then. He was looking at the page with the expression of a man who was working out whether he was bothered by something or just surprised by it. Does it bother you? She asked. That I went through the receipts? No. He said it without hesitation. I gave you the ledger. The receipts were there. He set the page down and looked at the rest of the summary. What bothers me is that I've been leaving money on the table for 4 years, and I didn't see it. You don't have time to track market prices. You're running a one-man operation on a mountain. That's an excuse. It's a fact, she said. There's a difference. She set down the mending. Are you going to talk to Kettner? I'm going to think about how. Think fast. Winter's the time he moves the most fur. If you're going to renegotiate, do it before the season peaks, or you'll wait until spring. He looked at her. You want to come with me? The question surprised her enough that she didn't answer immediately. To negotiate with your fur trader. You know the numbers better than I do right now. He'll think it's strange, a man bringing his wife to a trade meeting. Maybe. Silas folded the summary pages carefully and set them aside. Or maybe he'll understand that things have changed. He stood up and finally took his coat off. I'm not asking you to sit there and be quiet. I'm asking you to come because you'll catch things I miss. She looked at him for a moment and thought about what it had taken for him to say that, not the words themselves, which had come easily, but the posture behind them. She'd known men her entire life who would rather take a bad deal alone than admit in front of another person, let alone a woman, that someone else might handle part of it better. All right, she said. When? Next week. I'll send word to Kettner. She nodded and picked up the mending again. And Thursday? The junction meeting with Frank? Roy's coming. We ride out together. He moved to the fire. I've got the survey copy. Good. Clara. She looked up. The summary, he said. It's good work. She didn't know why that landed the way it did, somewhere solid and quiet, like a stone settling into the right place. She'd had people praise her appearance her entire life, and it had never felt like anything except noise. This felt like something else. "You should have a copy too," she said. "I'll make one tomorrow, Bob." Thursday came with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind off the ridge that got into everything. Silas and Roy Calhoun rode down together in the early morning, and Clara watched them go from the yard with her arms crossed against the cold, and then went inside and did not pretend she wasn't waiting. Roy Calhoun was exactly what Silas's 12-year description of him suggested: a compact, deliberate man in his mid-50s who spoke rarely and landed every word he used. He'd shaken Clara's hand when they met, and looked at her face with the simple directness of someone who was seeing a person, not a feature, and she had liked him immediately for it. She reorganized the cold cellar while she waited and then started on a problem she'd been turning over for a week: a gap in the north wall of the cabin where the log had been poorly chinked and was letting cold through in a way that would get worse as the temperature dropped. She found the clay and straw mixture Silas used for the purpose in the lean-to and spent the better part of the morning working it into the gap, which was satisfying in the specific way that physical work on a real problem always was. She was cleaning her hands at the basin when she heard the horses. Both of them came back intact and in their original number, which she hadn't been worried about, but was nonetheless relieved to see. She waited until they were in the yard. "How did it go?" she asked. Roy answered before Silas did. "Frank Darnell," he said, "does not like being handed a survey copy before he finishes his opening sentence." And he looked like a man who had found the entire morning more entertaining than he'd expected. Silas climbed down and handed his horse off to Roy to walk. "He pushed on the 1879 date," he said to Clara. "Said the markers in that survey had been placed wrong originally." "What did you say?" "I said that was interesting and that he could take it up with Aldous Craft, whose address I had right there and who had offered to come do a fresh survey." He paused. "He didn't take the address." "Because a fresh survey would confirm the original." "That's what I told him." Roy finished walking the horse and came back to stand with them. "Frank tried the friendly approach after that," he said. "Offered to settle it between neighbors. Said there was no need to bring in outside men." "He means no need to create a paper trail," Claire said. Roy pointed at her with a mild satisfaction. "Exactly what I said. Boone said the same thing a different way, and Frank ran out of moves." He glanced at Silas. "I'll say this for Darnell. He's smart enough to know when he's lost a hand. He folded clean. Didn't push it to the point of something he couldn't take back." "He'll try another way," Clara said. "He'll try another way," Silas agreed. "But not this winter. He doesn't want a legal fight going into the cold months any more than we do." Roy took his leave shortly after, with the straightforward efficiency of a man who had a long ride home and didn't see the sense in drawing out a departure. He shook Silas's hand and then turned to Clara and said, "Your husband told me about the notes you put together on the boundary lines. That's the kind of thinking that keeps land in a family." He said it plainly, without the slight condescension that often accompanied such compliments, and then he got on his horse and rode. Clara watched him go. "I like him," she said. "Most people do," Silas said. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She looked at him sideways. "Neither do you." He glanced at her. "Sometimes I don't say things at all." "That's different from saying things you don't mean." He considered that. "I suppose it is." Well, the trip to see Kettner happened on a Monday of the following week. A 2-hour ride down to the valley floor, and then another 4 miles east to the trading post Kettner ran out of a large log structure that smelled permanently of smoke and tallow and dried hide. Martin Kettner was a heavy-set man of about 60 who had the loose, unhurried movements of someone who had been conducting business on his own terms for so long that he'd lost the ability to be rushed. He came out to meet them in the yard and stopped when he saw Clara, which was a reaction she was accustomed to, though the quality of his surprise was different from most. Less predatory, more curious. "Brought company," he said to Silas. "My wife," Silas said. "Clara." Kettner looked at her with sharp, pale eyes that were doing quick and accurate assessment work. "Heard you got married," he said. "Didn't hear to who." He extended a hand to Clara. "Martin Kettner." "I know," she said. I've been going through the ledger. Something moved in his face. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of recalibration. He looked at Silas. Brought her to keep you honest, or me? Both, probably, Silas said. Kettner laughed. A short, genuine sound, and waved them inside. The meeting took the better part of 2 hours, and was, in Clara's assessment, one of the more interesting conversations she'd been part of. Kettner was not a dishonest man, which made it simpler. He'd priced Silas's fur at the original agreed rate because it had never occurred to Silas to revisit it, and because she understood this about Kettner within the first 20 minutes. He valued long relationships over maximum margin, and had simply never been challenged on the price because Silas was not a man who tracked market comparisons. She let Silas open it. He laid out the case plainly, without accusation, the way she'd suggested. Not, you've been underpaying me, but the market's moved and I think we need to look at the arrangement again. Kettner listened with his elbows on the desk and his eyes moving between them. Then he looked at Clara. You put those numbers together? Yes, she said. They're accurate, he said. It wasn't a question. I used the prices from the Valley merchants and 2 seasons of your own receipts. The comparison holds. Kettner was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the pages she'd brought and studied it. Then he set it down and looked at Silas. 22% increase on prime grade. I'll go there. Not 30. Silas glanced at Clara. 25, she said, and we'll give you right of first refusal before I take anything to the Valley merchants. Kettner looked at her for a full 3 seconds. Then he put his hand out to Silas. 25, he said, and right of first refusal. Silas shook it. Done. On the ride home, the sky had gone from pewter to a flat white that meant more snow before dark. The horses moved at an easy pace, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, which was comfortable in the way their silences had become. 22 to 25, Silas said eventually. He'd already decided on 22 before I said it. 25 was where he was willing to go. How do you know? He didn't hesitate, she said. When you hesitate at a counter, it means you're running math. He already had the number. Silas absorbed this. The right of first refusal. That was yours. It gives him something for the price increase. Makes it a trade rather than a concession. She looked at the trail ahead. He'll take better care of the relationship now. He got a benefit, not just a bill. A pause. My father used to say the best deals leave both people feeling like they won something. She glanced at him. He didn't talk about his father often, didn't talk about his past much at all, in the careful way of men who had organized their present around not examining certain things too closely. Was he a trader? Farmer, but he knew people. He was quiet for a moment. He died when I was 16. My mother 2 years after. She didn't say she was sorry. The word felt insufficient, and she'd learned that Silas didn't want insufficient things. Is that when you came west? I went to my uncle first, learned to trap, came up here when I was 22. He looked at the ridgeline ahead of them. The cabin was already there. Previous man had built it and then decided the altitude wasn't for him. Has it been for you? Yes, he said, without qualification. You never wanted to live somewhere with more people around? He thought about it honestly. I did, when I was young. Then I figured out that most of the things I wanted to do required quiet. He glanced at her. That's a harder thing to explain to people than it sounds. I understand it, she said. He looked at her, a longer look than usual, riding beside her in the fading afternoon light. Yes, he said, after a moment. I think you do. The snow started before they reached the cabin, light and dry and very cold. They rode the last half hour through it in a silence that had taken on a different quality than usual. Not just comfortable, but something warmer than that. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was there all the same. The hard winter Silas had predicted arrived in the second week of November, and did not apologize for itself. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days. The trail to the valley became impassable for a week at a stretch, and the wind off the ridge ran constant and mean, finding every imperfection in the cabin's walls and driving cold through it in thin needles. They lived close to the fire and learned each other's rhythms in the enforced proximity of two people who had no option but to share a small space through a long winter. Claire discovered that Silas slept less than she did, that he was up at 4 most mornings moving in the dark, tending the fire, going out to check the animals in the pre-dawn cold before she even woke. She discovered he read when he had the chance, old copies of whatever he could get his hands on, a worn history of the Western Territories, 2 novels in poor condition, a surveying manual that he apparently found genuinely interesting. She discovered he had a temper that surfaced about 3 times in the first month, always at inanimate objects rather than people, a stuck latch, a rope that wouldn't hold a knot in the cold, the lean-to roof that kept developing new problems. He would swear once, clearly, and then go silent and work the problem until it was resolved. She discovered also that he was a poor patient. The cold got into his hands in the second week of November, a deep ache in the joints that she recognized as the kind of thing that accumulated over years of outdoor work in severe weather. He didn't mention it, but she noticed how he held things, the slight stiffness in the morning, the way he flexed his fingers near the fire when he thought she wasn't watching. She made a poultice from what she had, linseed oil and dried herbs her mother had taught her, warmed near the fire, and set it on the table one evening without comment. He looked at it. "What's that?" "For your hands, the joints." A pause. "My hands are fine. Your hands hurt every morning. I've been watching you for 2 weeks. She looked at him without accusation. "Sit down. It'll take 20 minutes. He sat down with the particular reluctance of a man who was not accustomed to being taken care of and didn't know what to do with it. She wrapped the poultice around his hands the way her mother had shown her, firm and even, and he sat there looking at the table. "My mother did this," he said after a minute. "For your father?" "For herself. Her hands were the same way." He was quiet. She kept working until she couldn't. She didn't tell anyone how bad it had gotten. Clara didn't say anything. She finished the wrapping and left her hands resting lightly over his for a moment. Not a gesture, just the natural completion of what she was doing, and then she let go and moved to clean up. "You should do this every few days through the winter," she said. "It won't fix it. It'll help." "Where'd you learn it?" "My mother. She knew a lot of things." A pause. "She died when I was 12. He looked at her. It was the first time she'd said it plainly to him, and she felt the weight of it the way you always felt it when you said the true thing after a long time of not saying it. "What was she like?" he asked. The question surprised her. "Bash diye jest seit." Not because it was unusual, but because almost no one asked it. People said they were sorry and moved on to something else. "Practical," she said. Quiet when she was thinking, very loud when she was laughing. She could fix anything with what she had on hand. She looked at the table. "My father loved her completely and didn't know what to do without her. That's when things started going sideways, I think. He started holding on too tight to what he could still control. And you were what he could control." She looked at him. He met it steadily. "Yes," she said. Neither of them said anything for a while. The fire burned. The wind ran over the roof in long, cold waves. She thought about her mother's hands, capable and scarred, always moving, and about how certain people carried entire worlds inside them that other people never thought to ask about. She would have liked this place, Clara said, without planning to. The ridge, the way you can see 40 miles on a clear day. Silas was quiet for a moment. "We get clear days in February sometimes, between the storms." He looked at the fire. "I'll show you." It was a simple thing to say, and she understood it was also not simple at all. A February clear day was months away, a statement made by a man who was assuming, with a quiet certainty he'd never expressed directly, that she would still be there. She was, she realized, not troubled by that assumption. It was Roy Calhoun who brought the news about her father, riding up through a break in the weather in the last week of November with a letter he'd been holding since the mail rider's last run. Thomas Ashford had taken ill. Nothing life-threatening, the letter said, written by her Aunt Vera in the careful hand of a woman trying to convey urgency without alarm, but bad enough that he'd been in bed for 2 weeks with a lung sickness and could use someone familiar around. Clara read it at the table with Roy standing by the fire warming his hands and Silas somewhere out by the barn. "When did this come?" she asked Roy. 5 days ago. Mail rider left it with me when the trail was iced." He looked at her with a directness she respected. "I came as soon as there was a window." She read it again. Could use someone familiar. The careful circumlocution of a woman who meant, "Your father is scared and won't say so and needs his daughter." She set it down. Silas came in from the cold and saw her face and Roy's posture and understood without asking that something had come in. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it and handed it back. "You need to go," he said. "The trail. There's a window right now. 2 days, maybe 3, before the next system comes in." He was already moving toward the hooks where the heavier gear hung. "If we leave in the morning, we can get you to the valley in 1 day. I'll take you myself." "You don't need to—" "The trail's bad," he said. "I know where the ice is." He looked at her. "Clara." She stopped. "He's your father," he said. It was not complicated the way he said it. It was just true. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark thinking about Thomas Ashford and the floor he hadn't been able to look at, and the hat in his hands, and the East pasture, and all the years before that when she had been his treasure in the way that objects were treasures, kept, displayed, not asked about. And underneath all of that, in a place she hadn't expected to find, the simpler thing, he was sick, and he was her father, and she was his only child. In the morning, they packed light and left before first light, Silas leading the way on the trail he knew from years of riding it in every condition. It was brutally cold, and the ice was exactly where he said it would be, and he guided them around it without drama, picking the line through the worst sections with the unhurried accuracy of a man who understood that speed was less important than not falling. They were 3 hours down when Clara said, without planning it, "I didn't ask him to explain himself when I left. I just packed." Silas didn't answer right away. He was watching the trail. Would it have helped? No. She thought about it. But I might have said something I should have said. What? She looked at the trail between her horse's ears. That I knew he was scared. That I understood why he did it, even if I didn't forgive it. She paused. That I was his daughter, not the solution to the East pasture problem. Both things at once. Silas was quiet for a long moment, the horses moving through the cold. "You can still say it," he said. "I know." She looked at the valley coming into view far below them, the settlement's scattered buildings dark against the snow. "That's why I'm going." They reached the Ashford farm in the late afternoon. Vera met them at the door. A brisk woman in her 60s who took one comprehensive look at Clara and Silas and said, "Good. Both of you, come in," as though she had been expecting exactly this configuration. Thomas was in the front bedroom, thinner than Clara had seen him, and with the hollowed look of a man who had been fighting something and losing. He looked up when she came in and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Relief, maybe, and something more complicated underneath it. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Silas stayed in the doorway for a moment and then withdrew, which was the correct thing, and she noted it the way she was always noting the correct things he did. She looked at her father and said, "You look terrible." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your aunt's been telling me that for 2 weeks." "She's right." She looked at his hands on the quilt, big farmer's hands, mapped with work. How bad was it? Bad enough. Better now. He looked at her with the directness that illness sometimes gave people, stripping away the layers of careful management. "I'm glad you came." "I'm your daughter," she said. "Where else would I go?" He was quiet. Then, "I didn't ask you before." "No, I should have." She looked at him. This man who had never apologized, who had arranged her life the way he arranged his fields, who had loved her in the incomplete way of people who love the idea of a person more than the actual complicated human being in front of them. She looked at him and found, somewhere under the anger that was still legitimately there, the daughter who had been 12 years old when her mother died and had needed her father to hold things together and had watched him fail at it and had filled the gap herself. "You should have," she said, "and you didn't." And here we are. His eyes were wet. She hadn't seen that since her mother's funeral. The man, Thomas said. Boone. Is he? He's a good man, she said. Better than you had any right to count on. Her father looked at the ceiling for a moment. I hoped, he said. I didn't know. I hoped. She sat with him until he slept, which didn't take long. Then she went out to the front room where Silas was sitting with Vera drinking coffee, and the two of them were apparently in the middle of a conversation about the water rights that had been completely renegotiated by the creek's new flow pattern, and Vera was telling him in her direct way exactly where the new benchmarks were, and what Thomas had done wrong in the original filing. Clara sat down and Vera poured her coffee, and for a while the three of them sat in the warm front room of the house she'd grown up in while the wind ran around the eaves outside and her father slept in the next room, and she thought about what it meant to have people. Not many, but the right ones, in the specific places where they needed to be. She caught Silas looking at her once, checking quietly, the way he checked things. Not asking, just making sure. She gave him a small nod. He returned it and looked back at Vera and asked a question about the creek that was exactly the right question, and Vera answered it with the pleased energy of a woman who rarely got to talk to someone worth talking to. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and let the warmth come through. Outside, the next weather system was building somewhere beyond the ridge, but it hadn't arrived yet, and the three of them had the evening ahead of them, and that was enough. They stayed at the Ashford farm 3 days. Clara had not planned on 3 days. She had thought one night, perhaps 2, enough to see that Thomas was stable and that Vera had what she needed to manage the next stretch of his recovery. But on the second morning, her father asked, with the careful casualness of a man who was not accustomed to asking for things directly, whether she might stay one more day and help Vera sort through the farm records, which had gotten confused during his illness. She said yes. She didn't make him ask twice. The farm records were genuinely confused. 2 months of bills paid and unpaid mixed together, a feed account that hadn't been reconciled since September, and a correspondence with the county water office about the new creek benchmarks that Vera had started and not finished because she hadn't known what information to include. Clara sat at the kitchen table with it all spread out and put it in order the way she put everything in order, methodically and without drama. And Vera sat across from her and answered questions and occasionally said things like, "Your mother would have had this done in half the time," in a tone that was clearly meant as a compliment. Silas spent the 3 days making himself useful in the way he made himself useful everywhere, quietly and without announcement. He patched the gap in the barn wall that Thomas hadn't gotten to before he fell ill. He split 2 weeks of firewood and stacked it where it would stay dry. On the second afternoon, Clara looked out the kitchen window and found him deep in conversation with Thomas, who had come out to sit on the porch wrapped in a quilt, and the two of them were talking with the focused ease of men who had found a subject in common. She watched them for a minute without being seen. "He's a good man," Vera said from behind her, in the same plain tone she used for everything. "I know," Clara said. "Your father knows it too. He just doesn't know how to say he was right about something he did wrong." Clara looked at her aunt. Vera was 71 years old and had outlived 2 husbands and held opinions the way other people held grudges, firmly and without apology. "He told me he hoped," Clara said. "Hoping isn't the same as knowing." "No. But it worked out." Vera went back to the stove. "Sometimes hoping is enough. Don't be too proud to let it be." Clara thought about that for the rest of the afternoon and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The morning they left, Thomas came out to the yard to see them off despite Vera's objections. He looked better than he had 2 days ago. More color, less of that hollowed-out quality, and he stood in the cold with his coat buttoned wrong and shook Silas's hand with a grip that Clara could see had some strength in it. "You're taking good care of her," Thomas said. Silas looked at him steadily. "She takes care of herself," he said. "I just make sure there's firewood." Thomas looked at his daughter then, and Clara looked back at him, and something passed between them that wasn't forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implied a clean resolution, and this wasn't clean. It was complicated and ongoing and would probably stay that way. But it was something. An acknowledgement, maybe. A decision to keep going. "Write when you can," he said. "I will," she said. She turned her horse and they rode out. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because some things were easier to carry forward than to keep turning around to examine.
Jepatn.
The ride back to the ridge took longer than the ride down. The weather had shifted and the trail was in worse shape, iced in sections that hadn't been iced before, and soft in others where runoff had undermined the footing. They picked their way carefully and made no attempt at speed, and by the time they were halfway up the ridge, the light had gone flat and gray and the cold had real intention in it. Silas stopped at a switchback where the trail widened enough to rest the horses and looked at the sky with the particular attention of a man who had spent years reading it. "We've got maybe 2 hours before it comes in," he said. Clara looked up. The clouds over the ridge were low and moving. "What kind?" "Ice first, then snow." He looked at the trail ahead. "We can make it if we don't stop again." "Then let's not stop." They pushed on. The first ice came 40 minutes later, a fine sleet that stung and made the horses skittish and turned the trail in the shadowed sections into something genuinely dangerous. Silas moved to the outside of the trail on the steepest parts without saying why, and it took her a moment to understand. He was positioning himself where a slide would take him first. She filed that away without comment. They reached the cabin with the sleet turning to hard snow, and both of them so cold that the main room, which was not especially warm since the fire had been banked low for 3 days, felt like an embrace. Clara went straight to the fire while Silas saw to the horses, and by the time he came in, she had it built up and the kettle on and had changed into dry clothes. He came through the door with ice in his hair and his coat frozen stiff at the collar, and she handed him a towel without thinking about it, the way you handed things to someone when you knew where they'd be standing. He took it and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dim light. "You built the fire up fast," he said. "I've been watching you do it for 2 months." She moved to check the kettle. "Sit down before you fall down. You look like you've been carved out of the hillside." He sat. She heard the ice in his coat cracking as he moved. "Your father," he said after a moment. "On the porch. He told me something." She looked over her shoulder. "What?" "He said you used to run his whole farm operation by the time you were 19, kept the books, managed the correspondence, handled the suppliers." He paused. "He said he told people you helped out a little." The kettle was boiling. She poured without hurrying. "That sounds like him." He seemed bothered by it, saying it out loud. "He should be." She brought him the coffee and sat across the table. "But he said it, which is more than he's done before." Silas wrapped both hands around the mug. She noticed he did it more carefully now, the way the joint pain required, and looked at her. "Did you know, when you were doing it, that he wasn't telling people?" "Yes." She was direct about it. "He'd introduce me to someone and say, 'Clara helps me with some paperwork,' and I'd stand there and think about the full year of account ledgers I'd just spent 3 weeks reconstructing." She looked at her coffee. "I told myself it didn't matter, that the work was the work regardless of who got credit." "Did you believe that?" A pause. "Sometimes." He nodded slowly. "My uncle was the same way. I built half the infrastructure on his property the summer I was 17. Fences, drainage, a new well. He told everyone in town his boys had done it. He said it without heat. Not resentment, just the plain texture of a thing that had happened. I thought about it for a long time afterward, why it bothered me more than I expected." "What did you decide?" "That it wasn't about credit, it was about being seen." He looked at her. "There's a difference between people knowing you did something and someone actually seeing that you did it." The fire was going well now, throwing enough heat to reach across the room. Outside, the snow was coming down seriously, the wind running under it and building into the kind of storm that would close the trail for a week. Clara looked at this man across the table from her, ice still melting in his hair, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, talking about being seen, and thought about all the ways she had prepared herself for what this marriage would be and how thoroughly wrong she had been about every single one of them. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you accept the arrangement when my father came to you?" She had thought about asking this for months and hadn't, and now it came out plainly, which was probably the right way. "You could have found a wife through more normal channels. You're not a man who couldn't." He considered the question with his usual care. She had learned that he didn't rush answers to things that deserved thought. "Your father came to me about the water rights," he said. We'd been going back and forth on it for 2 years. I knew the land. I knew what those rights meant for his south fields. He paused. He brought up the other part at the end, like an afterthought. Was it? For him, maybe. I thought about it for 3 days before I said yes. He turned the mug slightly in his hands. I'd seen you in town, not in the way men usually mean that. I'd watched you move through a room, and I'd noticed that you always knew where everyone was and what they needed, and you never once made it about yourself. He looked at the table. Most people who look the way you look, they let it do the work for them. You never did. I wondered about that. Claire was very still. I told your father yes because I hoped that you might be someone worth knowing. He looked up. The rest of it, the arrangement, the terms, I knew that was wrong. That's why I told him you had to have the freedom to decide. If you'd come up here and looked at the cabin and looked at me and decided no, I would have taken you back to the valley. You never told me that, she said. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something for not being worse than I could have been. She absorbed that. It was the most carefully ethical thing she had ever heard a man say about himself, and it came from a man who apparently worried about the standards he was setting even when no one was watching. The question, she said slowly, you asked my father something, that first day. What was it? He was quiet for a moment. I asked him one question before I said yes to the arrangement. What question? He met her eyes. I asked him if you were the kind of person who kept going when things were hard. Something tightened in her chest. That's what you wanted to know? Not... She stopped. Not what you looked like, he said. I could see that. Not whether you'd make a good wife in the usual sense. I needed to know if you were someone who didn't quit. She looked at him for a long moment. The snow against the windows, the fire between them, the months of mornings and difficult problems and conversations that had slowly become the best part of her days. What did he say? She asked. The corner of Silas's mouth moved. He said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever known, and it had made his life very difficult. She made a sound that surprised her, a short, genuine laugh, the kind that arrived before you could decide about it. That sounds right. I took it as a yes, he said. They sat for a while after that without talking, and it was the most complete silence they'd had yet. Not empty, but full of something that hadn't been there before, something that had been building for months and had just found a shape. December settled over the ridge like a weight. The trail closed the week they returned and didn't reopen for 11 days. And during those 11 days, Claire and Silas existed in a world that was exactly the size of the cabin and its outbuildings and the known territory between. She had expected the confinement to be difficult. She had spent her whole life moving through space as though she owned it, riding out to the fields, walking the perimeter of the farm, going into town when she needed to. Being held in by weather was a different condition, a smaller world with higher walls. It wasn't difficult. That was the thing she kept running up against. She had enough to do. The ledger work, the mending that had accumulated, a pair of Silas's trapping maps she'd started organizing into a proper system, so he could reference prior season data without holding it all in his head. She read from his small library and asked him questions about the surveying manual that turned into hour-long conversations about the mathematics of land measurement that she found, to her own surprise, genuinely interesting. He was reading one evening, the territorial history, which he'd apparently read 3 times already, and she was at the table with the maps, and she said without looking up, "There's a section in here on Miller's Creek from 1874 that contradicts what the county has on file." He looked over. What kind of contradiction? The original course description puts the main channel 8 feet west of where the current records show it. She turned the map toward him. If this is accurate, it changes the drainage easement on your north boundary. He came to the table and looked at the map. He was close enough that she could see the lamplight catch the side of his face and the way his eyes moved across the paper, focused and specific, following the lines she was indicating. "Where'd this map come from?" he asked. "Your shelf. Behind the surveying manual. You had it rolled up." "I've had it 20 years. I found it in the cabin when I bought the property." She looked at him. "Did you know what it showed?" "Not this specific thing." He traced the channel line with one finger. "If the original course was there, Then the drainage easement doesn't cross your north pasture the way Darnell's claim implied. It runs well east of the fence line. She watched him absorb it. This is the piece Aldous Craft needs to see when he comes. Silas straightened up slowly. He had the look of a man who had just understood that something he'd been worried about was less dangerous than he thought, and that the person who'd found the thing that made it less dangerous had been sitting at his table the whole time. "You've been going through everything," he said. "I had time." She started rolling the map back carefully. "I wasn't snooping, I was looking for the property file, and I pulled everything from that shelf." "I know." He went back to his chair but didn't pick up the book. He sat looking at the fire. "Clara." "What?" "I need to tell you something." She set the map down and looked at him. His tone had shifted. Not alarmed, but serious in a way that was different from his usual seriousness. "When I talked to your father," he said, "before the arrangement, I told him I would not claim any husbandly rights unless you chose to give them." He looked at her. "I want to make sure you know that hasn't changed." She held his gaze. "You've been sleeping on the floor for 2 months." "I know." "In the winter." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I know you have. I hear you getting up in the night to keep the fire." She looked down at the map. "I've known since the first week." The fire went. The wind moved over the roof. "I'm not telling you this to ask for anything," he said. "I'm telling you because I don't want you to be uncertain about where things stand. You have time, as much as you need." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had been doing more of lately, with her actual attention rather than the assessing wariness she'd walked in the door with. She looked at this man who had given up his bed and his sleep, and apparently some structural expectation of what marriage meant because he had decided that none of it was worth having unless she was in it willingly. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why does it matter to you, whether it's willing?" She wasn't challenging him. She was genuinely asking. "Most men wouldn't think twice." He thought about it in his careful way. "Because I've been alone a long time," he said finally. "And what I don't want is company that's just filling a room. I want—" He stopped, tried again. "If you're here, and you're somewhere else in your head, that's lonelier than being actually alone." It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her about wanting her. She picked up the map and held it out to him. "Put this somewhere you won't lose it," she said. "We need it for Craft." He took it. Their fingers overlapped briefly on the roll of the paper, and neither of them moved for a moment, and then he took the map and she went back to the table. But something had shifted, the way things shifted after you said the true thing out loud. Not resolved, not finished, just moved to a new place. Frank Darnell made his second move in the second week of December, and he did it the coward's way, which was the way Clara had expected. She found out from Roy, who rode up through a break in the weather with his face set in the expression of a man delivering news he didn't want to deliver. He came in and accepted coffee and sat at the table and said without preamble, "Darnell's been talking in town, telling people the North Boundary dispute is settled in his favor, that Boone agreed to move the posts." Silas went very still. "He's also saying," Roy continued, looking at his coffee, "that the property isn't being worked properly, that it's underperforming and likely to go back on the market." He paused. "He's been having those conversations with the county land officer." "Reeves?" Silas said. "Reeves." Roy looked up. "Reeves owes Darnell 2 seasons of feed credit. That's not a neutral man." Clara set her mug down. "He's building a paper record," she said. "If he can establish that the boundary dispute was settled, even through rumor, even through secondhand accounts, and that the property is distressed, he creates grounds for a tax challenge. Underperforming land gets reassessed. Reassessed land gets a tax bill the owner can't pay." She looked at Silas. "He doesn't need to win a legal boundary fight. He needs you to lose the land through a different door." The room was quiet. Roy looked at her with the direct, measuring look she had come to understand was his form of respect. "That's exactly right," he said. "Craft," Silas said. "Craft needs to come now," Clara said, "before Darnell gets his account established with Reeves. If you have a current professional survey on file with the county before any tax reassessment is initiated, Darnell's narrative falls apart." She stood up. Do you have paper? Desk drawer, Silas said. She wrote 2 letters, Chase, one to Aldous Craft stating the urgency and offering to cover travel costs for an early arrival, and one to the county recorder's office in Harborton requesting confirmation of the current tax assessment status on the property. She wrote them quickly and cleanly and without stopping. She set both of them in front of Silas. He read them. The recorder's letter. You're asking them to confirm current status before any changes are filed. If they confirm it in writing, any subsequent change has to be documented as a change. It creates a before and after. Harder to claim the reassessment was routine. Roy picked up the Kraft letter and read it. The line about travel costs, he said. If cost is what's been slowing him down, remove that obstacle. Roy set it down and looked at Silas. Son, he said, which he'd probably never said to Silas before because Silas was not a man who invited that word. Your wife is smarter than both of us. Silas looked at Clara. I know, he said, not like a compliment, like a fact he had simply established. She felt the heat come up in her face and was annoyed at herself for it. Someone needs to ride to town, she said. These have to go with the next mail. I'll take them, Roy said. I'm heading back down today anyway. He stood and buttoned his coat. I'll also have a word with a few people. Darnell's been talking, so people in town already have a version of this. They ought to have a more accurate one. Don't start a fight on our behalf, Silas said. I'm not going to start anything. I'm going to have coffee with 3 or 4 people I've known for 30 years and tell them what I know. Roy picked up his hat. Information isn't a fight, Boone. It's just information. After Roy left, the cabin felt quieter than it had. Silas stood at the window watching the trail, and Clara stood beside him without planning to, both of them looking at the same rectangle of gray sky above the pines. He's going to keep coming, Silas said. Yes. Every time we close one door, he finds another. She crossed her arms. That's what men like Frank Darnell do. They're not smarter than you. They just have more patience for this kind of thing than most people. She paused. So do I. He looked at her. I've been managing difficult men my whole life, she said. My father, James Whitmore. Every man in the valley who thought a pretty girl was an object to be obtained or an obstacle to be managed. She looked out at the pines. Frank Darnell is not a new problem. He's just a new version of one. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, when you put it that way, I almost feel sorry for him. She glanced at him. It was a dry thing to say, and he'd said it with a straight face, and she felt the laugh arrive the same way it had the other night, before she could decide about it. Don't, she said. He doesn't deserve it. But she was still smiling when she turned away from the window, and she heard something behind her that she was almost certain was Silas doing the same. Kraft's reply came 12 days later, carried up by Roy on his next circuit. He would come the first week of January, weather allowing. He wrote in a cramped professional hand, been meaning to update the ridge surveys for 2 seasons and was glad to have a reason. Clara read the letter at the table and felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of a mechanism engaging the way it was supposed to. The county recorder's office replied the following week. Current tax assessment confirmed. No changes filed or pending. She dated the letter carefully and put it in the folder she kept for the Darnell matter, behind the boundary notes and the old map from the cabin shelf and the survey copy and the letters to Kraft. The folder was getting thick. She was filing the recorder's letter when she heard Silas come in and registered, without looking up, the particular way the cold came in with him, and the specific sound of his coat on the hook and his boots on the floor. She had learned all of it in the months since October, the small vocabulary of a person's daily presence, and she understood this the way she understood most things that mattered, gradually and then all at once. She finished filing the letter and closed the folder and set it on the shelf where it lived between the ledger and the survey copy. Recorder's letter came, she said. He came and looked at the shelf, at the organized materials that had not existed 3 months ago, that she had built from scattered papers and loose receipts, and a ledger full of undocumented decisions. He looked at it for a moment. I couldn't have done this, he said. Any of this. Not on my own. You would have managed Darnell eventually, she said. Maybe. Badly. He looked at her. That's not what I mean. She waited. I mean this. he said, and he moved his hand slightly. Not at the shelf, but at the room, the lamp, the table, the small, organized evidence of two people building a life in a space. I couldn't have done this on my own. I didn't know how much I was missing until it was here. The cabin held them both in its ordinary quiet. Outside the ridge, wind ran through the pines, and the fire was warm, and the folder of papers sat on the shelf between the ledger and the survey copy where it belonged, and Clara Boone stood in the kitchen of a mountain cabin that had become, without her quite noticing the moment it happened, the truest home she'd ever had. She didn't say anything. There were things she wasn't ready to say yet, things that were forming slowly in the place where feelings became words, and she had learned enough about herself to know she needed to let them form on their own schedule. But she stayed where she was, close to him in the narrow space between the shelf and the table, and she didn't move away. Aldous Craft arrived on the 4th of January on a gray horse, and with a leather satchel so worn it had gone the color of old saddle soap, and he turned out to be a small, precise man of about 65 who looked at everything twice before he said anything about it once. He came in, accepted coffee, looked around the cabin with the unsentimental attention of a man cataloging rather than admiring, and said to Clara, "You wrote the letter." "Yes," she said. "Not him." He nodded at Silas. "I wrote it," she said again, pleasantly. Craft looked at Silas. "Smart woman." "I know," Silas said. Craft drank his coffee and looked at the folder Clara set on the table in front of him, the boundary notes, the old map, the survey copy, the recorder's letter, the correspondence with his own office. He went through it page by page with the focused silence of a man who did not require conversation while he was working, and Clara let him have the silence, which Silas appreciated because he would have done the same. When Craft finished, he set the last page down and looked at the old map from the cabin shelf for a long moment. "Where did you find this?" "It came with the property," Silas said. "I found it rolled up on the shelf." "Do you know who made it?" "No." Craft turned it over carefully and looked at the back. "There's a notation here. Faint." He angled it toward the lamp. "E. Marsh, 1871. He set it down. Edgar Marsh surveyed most of this territory in the early 70s before the county formalized the records. His work was solid, better than solid. He looked at the channel line Clara had identified. If Marsh put the creek here, the creek was here. "And the drainage easement," Clara said, "runs well east of your fence line, clear of the north pasture entirely." He tapped the map. "This isn't just useful for the Darnell matter. This is a foundational document for your property. You should have it registered with the county records office." "Can you do that when you file the new survey?" she asked. He looked at her with the slight surprise of a man who had expected to explain a process and found the explanation unnecessary. "Yes," he said. "I can attach it as historical documentation. Then we'd have 2 surveys and the original Marsh map all on file. Any challenge would have to overcome all 3. Craft looked at Silas. "Where has she been?" "Running the operation," Silas said. They went out the next morning to walk the boundary lines, all 4 of them, because Roy had ridden up the evening before and Clara had told him he should be there, which Roy had agreed to without asking why, because by now he trusted her read of a situation the way he trusted weather coming off the ridge. The cold was serious, and the ground was iron hard, and Craft moved through it with a brisk efficiency that made his age irrelevant, setting his equipment up and taking his readings with the practiced economy of a man who had done this in worse conditions than this. He confirmed the north boundary at Silas's fence line within 3 feet of the original 1879 survey. He confirmed the creek channel position from the Marsh map. He found, on the east side of the property, a marker stone that had been moved. Not by weather. The ground around it was disturbed in a pattern that was too deliberate, too recent. He crouched beside it and looked at it without expression. "This has been repositioned," he said. "Within the last 2 months, I'd estimate. Ground hasn't fully settled around the base." Roy looked at Silas. Silas looked at the stone. "Darnell," Roy said. "Not a question." "I can't say that in a legal document," Craft said. He stood up. "What I can say is that this marker has been moved and document its current position versus where it should be based on the original survey." He looked at Clara. "That's a significant thing to have on record." "Can you note the disturbance pattern?" she asked. The condition of the ground around the base? I can note what I observe. Then observe it carefully. Kraft looked at her for a moment and then took out his notebook and began writing with a thoroughness that made Roy, beside her, exhale a quiet sound of satisfaction. They were back at the cabin by mid-afternoon, cold through and thorough in the way that physical work and difficult conditions made you thorough. Kraft sat at the table with his notes and began assembling the formal survey record. Clara made food because everyone needed it and because feeding people was a practical act that did not require sentiment to be an act of care. While Kraft wrote, Roy sat across from Silas and said quietly, "The moved marker. That changes things." "It's evidence of tampering," Silas said. "It's more than that. It means Darnell was up here, on your land, moving property markers." Roy kept his voice level. "That's not a boundary dispute anymore. That's trespass and interference with property records." Claire set food on the table and said, without sitting down, "It means we don't wait for him to file the tax challenge. We file first." Both men looked at her. Kraft's survey goes to the county recorder with the marsh map attached. With it, we include a formal notice of the disturbed marker and its documented position versus the surveyed position. We're not accusing anyone in the notice. We're simply putting the discrepancy on record. She sat down. If Darnell has been talking to Reeves at the land office, Reeves now knows that any action he takes on this property has a documented paper trail pointing back to a tampered marker. That's not a position any county official wants to be in. Roy put his fork down. He looked at Silas. "I've said it before." "I know," Silas said. "I'll keep saying it." "I know that too." Clara looked at her plate and said nothing, but the warmth that moved through her had nothing to do with the fire. Kraft left the following morning with the survey complete and a handshake agreement to file everything with the county recorder within 10 days. He also took a copy of the marsh map, carefully rolled and wrapped in oilcloth, and a letter Clara had written to accompany the filing that laid out the sequence of events in plain, dated, factual language that made no accusations and required none. Roy stayed one more day and then rode down with his own copy of everything, because Clara had made copies of everything, which Roy said was the smartest habit a person could have, and which Silas had stopped being surprised by. After they were both gone, the cabin settled back into its particular quiet, and that quiet was different now from what it had been in October. It had weight to it. The comfortable weight of a space that two people had genuinely occupied together. Clara was at the table that evening going through the updated ledger. The Kettner adjustment had already improved the numbers for the season, and she was projecting forward into spring with the kind of focused pleasure that working on a real problem gave her. When Silas came in from checking the animals and stopped by the fire and said her name, she looked up. He was still in his coat. He had the look of a man who had decided to say something and was doing it before he could reconsider. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set her pen down. "All right. Not about the land. Or the Darnells." He came to the table but didn't sit, stood on the other side of it with his hands at his sides. "About us." She waited. Outside, the wind was low tonight, the ridge holding still for once. "I know this isn't what you planned," he said. "Any of it. I know you didn't choose to come here. I know the first months were... I know what they cost you." He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at things he was serious about. "But I need to know where you are. Not where you think you should be, or what's practical, or what makes sense given everything. Where you actually are." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about October and the frozen grass and packing her trunk with the specific grief of someone who has been arranged like furniture. She thought about the woodpile, consistently full, that no one had mentioned. She thought about the Henderson boy and the coffee in the cold and the ledger and Kettner's handshake and her father on the porch and the folder growing thick on the shelf. She thought about a man who had slept on a hard floor through a mountain winter because he had decided that nothing was worth having unless it was freely given. "I'm here," she said, plainly, without the careful qualifications she usually wrapped around the things that mattered. He absorbed that. "Here, like, you've settled for it," or "Here like I'm here," she said, "like this is where I am." She looked at him. "I'm not good at saying things I'm not sure of yet. I haven't been sure of much in my life. but I'm sure of this place. I'm sure of what we've built." She paused. "I'm sure of you." The fire was the only sound for a moment. He came around the table. Not quickly. He moved the way he did everything, with deliberate attention, like the action deserved to be taken seriously. He stopped close to her and looked at her face with an expression that was not performance and not the careful neutrality he usually wore, but something simpler and more exposed than either. "I've been in love with you since October," he said. "Since the pantry." She blinked. "The pantry? You reorganized my pantry on the second day and told me I'd been lucky about the flour. I thought, there she is." He said it without embarrassment. "I've been thinking it ever since." She looked at him and felt something move through her that was not the careful, measured thing she usually allowed herself, something larger and less manageable and entirely real. "You could have said something. I told you I'd wait." "That was about something else." "It was about everything," he said quietly. She stood up. They were close enough that she could see the lamplight in his eyes and the specific way his expression had opened, all the careful neutrality set aside. She put her hand against his jaw. Not testing it, not tentative, just putting her hand there because that was where it belonged. And he went very still the way he went still when something mattered. "I'm not in love with you yet," she said honestly, "but I think I'm going to be. And I don't say that to most people." "I know," he said. "That's why it means something." She kissed him then, because the alternative was continuing to talk about it, and she had always been better at doing things than discussing them at length. He kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything: thorough, unhurried, paying full attention. When she stepped back, the lamp was still burning and the fire was still going and the ledger was still open on the table, and nothing about the room had changed except everything. "The bedroom door," she said. "What about it?" "You've been on the floor long enough," she said. He looked at her. "Come inside," she said. It was the same thing she'd been thinking for weeks. The same thing that had been forming in the place where feelings became words. She'd let it form on its own schedule, and now it was done, and here it was. "I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm not asking because of anything except that I want you there." He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. Just that, just the one gesture, careful and certain. "All right," he said. January became February the way months became each other on the ridge, by accumulation rather than announcement. The storms came and went. The trail opened and closed. The county recorder's office sent a confirmation of filing that Clara dated and put in the folder. Kraft sent a copy of the registered survey. No word came from Reeves at the land office, which meant one of two things. Either Darnell had decided the paper trail was too clean to challenge, or he was finding a different door. Clara watched for the different door and kept her records current and did not relax because men like Frank Darnell did not stop, they redirected. The different door came in the form of a conversation Roy reported from town in mid-February. Darnell had apparently told several people at the feed store that Silas Boone's wife had been managing the property filing because Boone himself didn't understand the process, implying with the particular cruelty of a man who knew which lever to pull that Silas was being run by a woman and couldn't manage his own affairs. Roy told them this at the table on a Tuesday afternoon and watched their faces carefully when he did. Silas's face didn't change much. "What did people say?" "The ones worth caring about laughed at him," Roy said. "Martha Gaines said that a man who let his wife use her brain was smarter than a man who didn't, which coming from Martha is practically a revolution." "And the others?" "There are always others." Roy set his mug down. "Darnell's trying to separate you, make it a dignity question for you. See if you'll distance yourself from Clara's involvement to save face." Silas looked at Clara. She was looking at the table, and she was, he could see, not upset by what Darnell had said. She was working something through. "He can say whatever he likes about me," she said finally. "Clara, no, I mean it." She looked up. "Let him say I run the operation. Let him say Silas doesn't understand the filing process. He can say all of it." She looked at Silas. "Does it bother you? What he's telling people?" Silas considered it with genuine honesty. "No," he said. "You do understand the filing process better than I do. That's true. I don't see why it's shameful." "Because some men think it is," she said. "And Darnell is betting you're one of them." He's wrong. I know he is. She looked back at Roy. So let him keep saying it. Every time he does, he's describing a functional operation that has its tax records straight, its boundary lines documented, and its accounts organized. If that's embarrassing, we'll survive the embarrassment. Roy sat back in his chair with the look of a man who had just watched something settle into exactly the right position. The other thing, he said more carefully. There's talk he's approached two of the merchants about the property, asking about its history, whether it's ever been on the market, that kind of thing. He's laying groundwork, Clara said. In case the tax route doesn't work, he wants people to believe the property is in play, creates an atmosphere, makes it seem like acquisition is already in motion. How do you stop that? She thought for a moment. You don't stop the talk. You make the property undeniably stable. She looked at Silas. The spring Kettner negotiation. You should bring him up here. Let him see the operation. To the cabin? Show him the trap lines. Show him the store management. Show him what it looks like. She paused. Darnell can tell people the property's in play, but if your primary trade partner has been up here and seen a well-run operation, that's a counter-narrative that doesn't require you to say a word. Silas looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since Roy's last visit. Roy made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time, short and genuine. I'm going to say it one more time, and then I'll stop, he said to Silas. Please stop, Silas said. She is the smartest. Roy stopped. But he was smiling at his coffee, and so was Clara, and Silas looked at both of them with the expression of a man who was losing a battle he didn't particularly want to win. Kettner came up in the third week of February, on the first genuinely clear day the ridge had offered in a month. He arrived and looked around with those sharp, pale eyes and said very little for the first hour, which Clara had expected because Kettner was a man who formed his opinions from observation rather than conversation. He walked the trap lines with Silas while Clara stayed at the cabin, and when they came back in the late afternoon, Kettner sat at the table and looked at the organized operation she'd built. The filed records, the updated ledger, the map system, the seasonal projections, with the expression of a man updating a file in his head. You're running this like a proper business, he said. It always was one, Clara said. It just didn't look like it from the outside. No. He was quiet for a moment. I've heard some things. From the valley. From Frank Darnell, she said. He looked at her. Some from Darnell. Some from others repeating Darnell. He tapped the table once. I've known Frank Darnell for 20 years. I've known Silas Boone for 12. He left the comparison exactly where it was, without completing it, which told her everything. What does Darnell want from you? She asked directly. He came to see me last month. Asked if I'd had any sense of Boone wanting to sell. Said he'd heard things. What did you tell him? I told him I hadn't heard anything like that. Kettner looked at Silas. That's still accurate? Yes, Silas said. Then I'll keep saying it. He picked up his mug. The price adjustment. It's been working out. The prime grade this season is better than last year. The south-facing line has been more productive, Silas said. Clara reorganized the rotation. Kettner looked at her again with that flat, accurate attention. The Darnell thing, he said. Is it settled? The survey's filed, Clara said. The marker tampering is documented. The county recorder has everything on record. She met his eyes. If he pushes further, he pushes into a position where a county official has to either acknowledge a tampered survey marker or pretend the documentation doesn't exist. That's a problem Reeves doesn't want. You think Reeves is involved. I think Reeves owes Darnell money, and that's enough. She paused. I think Reeves is also the kind of man who won't walk into a documented trap for someone else's benefit. Kettner sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at Silas. When your father-in-law approached me last year about this property, he said, which was the first Clara had heard of this, and she kept her face still, I told him the operation was undervalued and the man running it was solid. Silas looked at him carefully. Thomas Ashford came to you. Last spring, before the arrangement. Kettner set his mug down. He wanted to know what I thought of you, whether you were a man who'd be standing here in 10 years. He glanced at Clara. I told him yes. The room was quiet. She thought about her father and his hat in his hands and the floor he couldn't look at. She thought about him on the porch with Silas and the conversation she hadn't been able to hear. She thought about hoping not being the same as knowing, and Vera's voice saying sometimes hoping is enough. It didn't fix what he had done. It didn't turn a wrong decision into a right one, but it was a piece of him she hadn't had before, and she filed it the way she filed everything, carefully, in its proper place, neither dismissing it nor making it more than it was. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Kettner. He nodded once and stood up, because Kettner was not a man who lingered in emotional moments. "I'll see myself out to the barn," he said. "My horse could use water before the ride down." After he left, Silas looked at Clara across the table. She was looking at the ledger without seeing it. "Did you know?" he asked. "No?" She looked up. "Did you?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it change anything, how you feel about what he did?" She thought about it honestly because he deserved that. "It makes it more complicated," she said. "It doesn't make it right. He still arranged my life without asking me." She looked at her hands. "But he asked around first. He didn't just, he tried to know. In the way he knew how to." "In the way he knew how to," she agreed. "Which wasn't good enough. But it was something." Silas reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was a simple thing, and he did it simply, without announcement. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that while the clear February light came through the window and the fire held, and outside Kettner's horse drank water in the yard. The letter from the county recorder's office came in the first week of March. It was addressed to Silas Boone, and it was formal and brief, and it confirmed that the property survey had been registered, the historical marsh map had been accepted as supporting documentation, and that the office had noted the discrepancy in the relocated marker for its records. There was a final line that said, in the language county offices used when they were saying something without quite saying it, "No further action regarding this property is currently under review." Clara read it twice and then set it on the table in front of Silas. He read it. He set it down. "It's over," she said. "For now," he said, which was the right answer. "For now," she agreed. "He'll look for something else eventually, but not this winter, not this property, not this way." Silas looked at the letter and then looked out the window at the ridge, where the snow was beginning to pull back from the south-facing slopes in the slow retreat that meant spring was coming. It was still weeks away. The trail would stay difficult until April, but the angle of the light had changed in the last 2 weeks, coming in lower and longer through the window, and you could feel the difference even if you couldn't name the exact day it had started. "I've been thinking about the north pasture," he said. "For what?" "Cattle. Small herd. Roy knows a man in the valley selling off part of his stock in the spring." He looked at her. "The projections you did in January, would the numbers support it?" She thought about the pages she'd worked through, the spring estimates, the improved Kettner income, the buffer they'd built. "With the right price on the stock, yes. Marginally the first year. Better by the third. Roy thinks 6 head to start. See how the pasture handles it. Talk to Roy's man before the trail opens all the way. Get a price before the spring buyers are in the market." She paused. "And fence the northwest corner before you bring them up. There's a gap above the creek bend." He looked at her with that expression she had stopped trying to name and had simply started accepting. The one that meant he was seeing her specifically and fully in the way that people spent whole lives hoping to be seen. "I'll need help with the fencing," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm here." Spring came up the ridge the way it always did, gradually and then suddenly, the snow retreating inch by inch for weeks. And then one morning the south slope was clear and the creek was running high and the air had changed from iron to something that actually moved. They fenced the northwest corner in the last week of March, working alongside each other in the mud and the cold that was still cold but differently cold now. Not the killing cold of January, but the raw, workable cold of a season turning. Silas drove the posts and Clara set the wire, and they moved down the line without a system because they didn't need to talk about the system. They had just learned each other well enough to know where the other one would be. Roy's man came up with 6 head of black cattle in mid-April, and left them in the north pasture and took his money and rode back down, and the three of them, Roy, Silas, and Clara, stood at the fence and watched the animals settle into the new grass. "Good stock," Roy said. "Better than I expected for the price," Silas said. Clara was watching the cattle move through the pasture and thinking about the ledger projection and the second year and the third, and the way a thing built carefully over time became something different from the thing you'd started with. She was thinking about October and a trunk being carried inside, and a man laying his bedroll by the fire and saying, "I'll wait until your heart decides," and how she had stood in that room thinking she understood the shape of the next years, and how completely, entirely wrong she had been. Roy left at noon. Clara and Silas came back inside and she made coffee, and he sat at the table and she sat across from him, and outside the north pasture held 6 head of cattle on new spring grass, and the trail to the valley was open, and the folder on the shelf was complete, and the ledger was organized, and the survey was filed. "I want to write to my father," she said. He looked at her. "Tell him about the cattle, the pasture." She looked at her hands. "Tell him we're doing well." "Are you?" She looked up. "We are." He nodded. "Tell him to come up in the summer if he's able. Roy can ride down and bring him." She looked at him for a moment. "You want my father here?" "He's your family," Silas said simply. "And he's not a bad man. He's a man who did a bad thing and knows it." He paused. "I've known men who did bad things and didn't know it. That's worse." She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant to hold someone to the full truth of what they'd done without requiring them to be unredeemable. About how the cleanest kinds of anger were also the most useless, the kind that insisted on a purity the other person was never going to achieve. Thomas Ashford had arranged his daughter's life like a transaction, and he had known somewhere in himself that it was wrong, and he had tried in the insufficient way of a man who didn't have better tools to at least arrange it toward someone worth her time. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. "All right," she said, "I'll tell him to come in July." She pulled paper toward her and began the letter, and Silas sat across from her with his coffee, and didn't read, just sat in the same room the way they'd learned to do, companionably present, not performing the presence but just in it, which was the difference between sharing a space and actually being somewhere with someone. She wrote 3 pages to her father. She told him about the cattle and the pasture and the survey and Kettner and the clear February day when you could see 40 miles off the ridge. She told him they were building something up here. She told him to come in July and bring Vera because Vera would have opinions about the pantry organization, and Clara had missed having someone argue with her about it. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for the next time someone rode to town. Then she looked at Silas, and he looked at her, and she thought about what he had said in October in this same room. "Your beauty caught my eye, but I stayed because I hoped one day your heart might choose me." She had not chosen him that day. She had been too busy surviving to choose anything, but she was choosing now. Every day that she stayed and worked and built and argued about pantries and wrote letters and made poultices and slept beside him in the narrow bedroom was a choice. Not the dramatic, announced kind that people wrote about, the quiet, daily kind that actually meant something. That was what nobody told you about love. Not the falling, which was easy, which happened to everyone, which required nothing of you. The choosing, the showing up the next day and the day after, not because it was effortless, but because the thing you were building together was worth the effort of building it. Clara Ashford, Clara Boone, had come up this ridge as an arranged object and had become, through stubbornness and organization, and a man who had thought to ask exactly one question before saying yes, a person who had a home she'd actually chosen. That was not a small thing. That was, in the cold, clear accounting she had always preferred, everything. Outside the window, the north pasture spread green and new under the April sky, and the ridge held them both in its particular silence, and the fire was low but warm, and there was nowhere else she would rather have been.